This presentation is on social and political philosophy and social justice education. Notting says that the current debate in social and political philosophy is between liberalism and communitarianism. And these are hyperlinks if you want more information about these two political and social traditions. You can find it through those links. At the bottom of the slide, you can see the George Mason University's Institute for Humane Studies that represents liberalism, and the George Washington University Institute for Communitarian Policy Studies, which represents communitarianism. Liberalism is focused on individual liberty, inalienable rights. It's concerned with equality, minimal government. The modern liberals have greater emphasis on equality. They see positive freedom, meaning use of the government to support equality. And modern conservatives have a greater emphasis on liberty or negative freedom, interested in stopping the government from interfering with liberty. But our modern liberals and conservatives that we roughly associate with the Democrats and Republican political parties both spring from the tradition of liberalism. Communitarians are focused on communities. They are interested in how individuals are developed within communities and what individuals owe to their communities. They have a sense of shared moral values. They say rights are a product of consensus. This is quite Deweyan. And the good precedes the right. So the thing that is going to, in a way, thinking about utilitarianism, serve the highest utility for the most number of people is going to precede what is right from a justice perspective or from the perspective of individual liberty. From the last presentation on ethics, you should remember non-consequentialist ethics or deontological ethics. These are rule-based. They're rooted in individual rights. They value equality. The criticism here is that it's become difficult to talk about the rights or legitimate demands of a community over that of the individual. It strips people of their identifiable social characteristics. They become these atomistic units, disconnected from community. And it requires thinking that is hyper-rational and not the sort of thinking that most of us do in moral situations. Digging a little bit more into Kant that we heard about in the last presentation. Lived from 1724 to 1804, and you see a picture of him there. It should be hyperlinked with a little bio, probably from Wikipedia or Philosopher's Index. He championed individualistic liberalism, the idea that we rely on individual goodwill and logic rather than rules of community. He came up with a categorical imperative. That's what we know him for in most cases. Act that you can logically will that your act should become law. That is, act so that you can logically will that all others in similar situations will be bound to do what you have chosen. So, rather inflexible. Universalizability as a test of moral decisions. So is this good for me, for you, the person over there, for all times? The individual is an actual embodied person. That's irrelevant. Complex people are reduced to a reasoning machine. And again, there's no consideration of community, social status, experience, age, competency, ability, interests, location, relationships. Here's the paradox. Great emphasis on autonomy, but uniformity is expected for the products of that autonomy. So super individualistic as long as everyone behaves the same. Next, from the liberal tradition, we have John Rawls, lived from 1921 to 2002. And again, you have a picture of him, which is hyperlinked. He locates himself in the Kantian tradition. Problems with the individualist paradox, so he's updating Kant a bit. The individual is sacred, his or her rights are settled, and yet he or she is not recognizable as an individual. He asks, how would you balance liberty and equality? So he developed a theory of justice, and you can get more on that. The idea, the book is hyperlinked there. People in the original position before their own birth are fully rational, but have no idea what their actual positions in society will be. So this is his thought experiment. They know nothing of their own character or personality. They must create the rules by which they will live from behind a veil of ignorance. So when Rawls was asked to think of a just set of rules and how people would come up with them, he said this is what would work. So the veil of ignorance will ensure that people will come up with the most just social order. Here's a critique of Rawls from the communitarians, and I would also add from justice-oriented educators and critical pedagogues. The persons deliberating behind the veil of ignorance are not real people, and what emerges are just hypotheses for real people to try out. Rawls and Kant rely too much on rationality and the procedures that come from purely logical processes. Real people are affected by things that are not strictly logical. So emotions, what we call tribal or group affiliations, circumstances, perhaps even rational self-interest. Depends on your, I guess, basic philosophy about human beings being either strictly selfish or other-oriented. Evolutionary biologists find evidence for both. Now moving on to John Dewey. John Dewey's a consequentialist, though not a utilitarian. He doesn't believe in one greatest good, and he objected to the separation of means and ends. He thinks of himself as a pragmatic liberal. He has sympathies for just procedures. Justice comes from consequences, not procedures that come before deliberation and reflection. Also could be called a democratic communitarian. Policies should be tested in real communities, revised and revoked if they do not work toward agreed upon ends. A democratic community cannot be assessed entirely from within. People must be taught the values and mores of community. So we see John Dewey's pragmatism, he called himself a natural philosopher, natural pragmatist. You can see he's influenced by both communitarianism and liberalism. More from Dewey on justice and equality in education. What the best and wisest parent wants for his own child, that must the community want for all its children. Any other ideal for our schools is narrow and unlovely. Acted upon, it destroys our democracy. So this is his idea of equal education, or the assumption of the will of the people, who are supposed to be the ones making decisions about education. It's always intended from the founding of the United States to be a local affair. Commenting on inequalities in physical resources, we have Jonathan Kozol's work. I've highlighted Savage Inequalities and linked to that for you. Also highlighting inequalities are care advocates. There's no defense for miserable conditions. We should care for all children because it is the loving thing to do, not because it is the law, or because it has something to do with the outcome for society, but because it is the loving thing to do. Commenting on inequalities in relationships, children with no academically competent and loving adults in their lives can't have justice and equality in education. Commenting on inequalities in curriculum, Should we all have the same curriculum? Should children have a choice in curriculum? Should they be placed in different curricular tracks based on their ability or their interests? Of course, there are arguments defending inequalities in physical resources. Some say that a certain amount of inequality in society is necessary to promote the general welfare. You might think of this as more of a utilitarian argument. Financial resources do not determine the quality of education. You hear this from traditionals who come from a liberal perspective, the liberal tradition, who don't want government interference. And this is one of the reasons that they point to say that the government shouldn't interfere to throw more money at education. Class size does not affect how teachers teach. This is an idea, again, defending the position that we shouldn't invest more in education to reduce class sizes, though we have research that suggests that class sizes are among the primary factors that affect classroom interactions, teaching, learning, social cohesion, everything. The low number of students taking college preparatory courses in poor schools is a result of poor student attention and ability. It's the idea of blaming students and looking at the outcomes of education and attributing the cause of those to student deficiency. There's only so much money to spend on education. The idea of that there is limited resources and we should invest where our money is going to get the best rate of return. This is business thinking. It says, if children in community A are destructive to the school building, why waste money making repairs? The money would be more effectively spent on science equipment and books for children in community B who will not destroy what is bought for them. You've probably heard people talking about kids in schools that way, referring to kids, usually poor kids, maybe minority kids, as being animals. They can't have anything nice, they'll destroy everything. Sociologists have reasons for why there is the phenomenon, the ownership phenomenon, where people expect to have good things, have responsibility for owning things, and seem to take care of things. In reality, they have the resources to do so. They have the norms built up that says this is your responsibility. They have every reason to believe that these things belong to them. But it does come down to resources and a sense of ownership. Here's what Rawls said about inequality. First, the conditions of the first principle have to be met. Each person has an equal right to the most extensive liberty compatible with a similar liberty for others. It's kind of hard to arrange. The difference principle, to support inequalities, one has to show that the extra funds invested in the education of well-off children benefit the least advantaged. So I guess this might inspire the theory of trickle-down economics or trickle-down application of funding. The intuitive idea is that the social order is not to establish and secure the more attractive prospects of those better off, unless doing so is to the advantage of those less fortunate. This is what Rawls says, and where inequality can be compatible with justice. Dewey and inequality. Dewey would respond, give money a chance to those people who say you can't keep putting money in schools. So would Jonathan Kozol. We should provide adequate resources always. Look for more than higher test scores when assessing consequences. Face-to-face community life is key. We must act in direct communication with one another and with the families who have children in the schools. The problem with Dewey's approach: important political decisions are no longer made in such communities. Centralization of schools has been removed from local communities, sometimes to the city level, sometimes to the state level. We have federal legislation that even set mandates at the national level, and still does. Minorities and the poor are increasingly isolated in their own communities. No communication between poor communities and those making the political decisions. These are far too often the conditions under which decisions are made about schools. Here Noddings is coming in to tell us the importance of relationships. An impoverishment of spirit often accompanies financial poverty. Poor parents become the living representation of meaninglessness and helplessness. Teachers must represent whole persons, not just instructors. Students need to see that possibilities in education are real for their own future. Oftentimes they see their likely future considering structures that are built to disadvantage them and sometimes resist complying, even though it looks like it might be in their own best interest. School reformers mention importance of family involvement, but very little about quality of relationships. Reformers, mostly white or affluent, and you hear them referred to as the school reform people, are reluctant to talk about the quality of relationships in cultures other than their own. For example, Latino, Southeast Asian, or Black, who are overrepresented in the families of poor students. Traditional theories have concentrated on the public aspect of lives, not the private. More from Noddings on relationships and communities. So growing emphasis on the importance of communities. Care must be taken. Communities can be self-serving, exclusive, and demanding. Communities can be coercive as well as cooperative, unforgiving and punitive as well as protective. Community can be either good or bad, wise or foolish. These are Noddings' observations. So she's cautioning us not to convert entirely to communitarians and worship communities above individuals. Referring to curricular inequalities, Mortimer Adler's Paideia proposal is that all students should have the same curriculum through 12th grade. The same education for all is a requirement of democracy. Children have many different interests and talents, academic, mechanical, artistic, athletic, musical, etc. So this has to be considered when, in light of this proposal. Society has organized schools and their curriculum by class, not by individual interests. So this is actually the way that schools have been used as sorting machines, as machines that actually reproduce class and society. So you can see the attractiveness of the Paideia proposal, and this is still thought to be the most just thing to do from a classical liberal perspective. Curricular inequalities, Michael Apple says, the decision to define some groups' knowledge as the most legitimate as official knowledge, while other groups' knowledge hardly sees the light of day, says something extremely important about who has the power in society. Behind the educational justification for a national curriculum and national testing is an ideological tack that is very dangerous. So he's critiquing the idea that everyone learns the same language or the same knowledge because it is the knowledge of the dominant class. In the interests of national competitiveness and the privileged classes, children of the poor will be more rigidly ranked and more firmly stuck in their lower places. So when you have a standardized national curriculum and it's already the knowledge associated with the dominant class children are always going to do better, and this is going to be far more damaging because what it does is legitimize inequalities. What it does is says, here's a fair system, and everyone has a chance to compete, and regularly there are some children who don't do as well. So either there must be something wrong with them, they're defiant, or what can we do? There must be other ranks of society for them to occupy. Dewey in the curriculum. The content of study is not nearly as important as how it is learned and the amount of thought invested in learning. He's talking about problem-based learning and thematic learning. Dewey recognized the importance of some common learning. For example, subjects like geography were important to him. The best and wisest parents do not define equal education as identical education. The best and wisest parents in Dewey's mind are the people who understand the principles of teaching and learning and have the ideals of democracy to inform their choices. Education organized around a few broad talents and interests and enhanced by a serious study of common human problems stands the best chance of achieving a meaningful equality. Notting's conclusion: what schools can do is limited. It can help some escape from poverty, but not all. All work is valuable and should be paid decently. This is her idea about a just inequality. So if there's an unevenness in the distribution of people into lines of work, that work should be all fairly, decently compensated. Today, the best the schools can do is provide adequate facilities for all children, long-term caring relationships that support intellectual development, and differentiated curricula, non-hierarchically designed. So again, not assigning highest status to what we call traditional subjects or college placement classes. And Nottings has a plan for teachers and kids staying together, looping, we would call it today, for successive years in order to develop the relationships that she believes are essential for learning and caring and developing moral people. And I'm adding on here information about social justice from Heather Hackman. She has four quadrants for multicultural group dynamics. She suggests that we teach from a social justice perspective. You've got content mastery, tools for critical analysis, tools for social change, tools for personal reflection, and awareness of multicultural group dynamics. Utilizing any one of these components can benefit a classroom. So in teaching any content or a variety of content, if you're thinking about the elementary classroom, these are the tools that will ensure that education is justice-oriented. You can think about content mastery as more in-depth exploration of history from multiple perspectives, examining the critiques of mainline assumptions about history, investigating who gets to contribute to history and who authorizes history textbooks. These are tools that have to be taught, so she includes the direct teaching of tools for critical analysis. We think of it as critical thinking. The tools for social change, so letting students know how they can take action in their communities. Tools for personal reflection. We might think of journaling activities, paper assignments, even mindfulness exercises. And then so along with those tools, the content mastery or a full complete education, other multicultural educators have said, an awareness of multicultural group dynamics. So an awareness of how certain people's voices have traditionally been given more attention and others have been marginalized or muted.